So our webinar today is going to be on vectorizing in Flexi. So we'll firstly talk a bit about why you would vectorize something, and then we'll move on to processes looking at different kinds of vectorizing in Flexi, and we'll investigate when the different types of vectorization, sorry, when it's better to use a certain kind of vectorizing. So we'll just proceed with the introduction just while we wait for everyone. So this is the structure of our webinar today. First of all, we'll do a short introduction, which is this. And then we'll have a teaching segment, which will go on until we've finished the content. And then we'll have a Q&A segment at the end. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to type them in the chat, and either I'll address them or my colleague will note them down, and at the end we'll address them in the Q&A. Okay, so what is vectorizing? You have kind of two main formats for design files, vector and bitmap. So the difference really is that bitmap files are entirely rasterized. So every single pixel of the file is a pixel, and so it's just colored pixels. You can't really do anything with it. It's just a printable object, and that's it. Now a vector object is mathematical lines and curves. So where that differs in our software is we can recognize those mathematical curves as cut lines for direct cutting. Also, if you convert bitmap logos into vector objects, you can resize them without losing quality. Whereas if you resize a bitmap design, it doesn't get, the quality is not improved unless you have software for populating pixels. So we'll have a little look into that as we go through some examples. So the main tools that we're going to be covering in Flexi are the Autotrace function. It's a very quick and easy function for tracing black and white bitmaps. Color trace. This is for like rasterized color logos with very bold colors, and we'll show you some good and some bad examples of how this works. Bezier curves, which converts the points of your rasterized object into points for plotting Bezier curves. And then we have the enhanced curves and enhanced corners function. And so with these different tools, we're going to do some examples, and we're going to break down the differences between them, so you guys can understand which tool is best for which situation, essentially. Okay, so we're pretty much ready, I believe. So let's go into the first example. So the first example we're going to look at is the Autotrace function. So all of the vector options that we have are under this bitmap toolbar here. So under bitmap and vectorize, you'll see all of the tools that we're going to look at. So we have the Autotrace, the color trace, the Bezier, the curves, and the corners. Okay, and so we'll go over these one at a time, and we'll take a look at how they work. So the first thing we're going to import is a simple example for auto tracing. So auto tracing works best for simple black and white bitmaps like this. So we'll zoom in a bit. We can see this is a bitmap object. There's lots of pixelation here. We can't increase the size. We can't change the colors. We can't send this to cut. So if I try and cut this through the cut plot window, it tells me that there's no cuttable object within the current setting. So the auto trace is a very, very simple way of converting simple black and white objects into cuttable objects. So we're going to go to bitmap, Vectorize, and Autotrace. This is the first tracing tool that we'll look at. So we're going to just simply select it and then click and drag over my bitmap and release. Then in the selection tool, we can drag across the object here. And I'm just going to select it here. I'll move this over. And then in the fill stroke editor, I'm going to remove the wireframe so you can see how it's traced the object. Now, normally, if you want this to be as it was before with the white in the background, you can just compound it like that. Or you can just leave it without the fill, as you wish. So this here is just a trace of the contrast between different elements of our object. So where there are nice straight lines and very obvious curves, this is a quick and easy tool, basically. So if the quality of the image isn't too bad, it's very easy to just use the auto trace function to trace objects. This object now is vector, so I can resize it as much as I want without losing quality, like so. If we compare that to the bitmap, the more I resize the bitmap, sorry, that's Alexa. The more I resize the bitmap, the more obvious the pixelation is and the worse the quality is. With a vector object, you can resize it infinitely because it doesn't work with pixels. It works with lines, with curves, with plotted coordinates. This object is now a cuttable object. So if I go to my cut plot window, we have my object here. If I want to make some vinyl decals out of this, I can simply send this to my cutter and it will work perfectly. I can also increase the size, as we mentioned before, as much as we would like without affecting the overall quality of the curves. So there we are. So again, we'll just go through that demonstration and show you how you can use it. So this is good for those simple black and white logos that you can find pixelated anywhere on the internet. If you want to cut them out as vector, select it, bitmap, vectorize, auto trace, click and drag, and there you are. You now have a cuttable vector version of the file. And as we were showing earlier, if you want to change colors or if you want to make modifications, if you uncheck the wireframe option, the object will be filled and you can go to arrange and compound, also Control M, and the object will be compounded. Here you can work with it as its own vector object. So you can change colors, you can modify parts independently. Yeah, there you are. Okay, so the next example that we will look at is the color tracing. So I'm going to import a few files here and we'll take a look at them. Yeah. Okay. So as we explained with the auto trace function, the tracing looks for contrast between two colors. So if you have an image like this, which has gradients, it's not going to trace very well. And we'll show you that now. So if I go again to bitmap, vectorize, and color trace, I see my options here in Design Central. The important option at first is the number of colors. So we see here we have kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 colors. You can go all the way up to kind of 16. So if we just say we're going for the main 8 colors, we can click and drag and it will process. There we are. And we can see that it has defined 8 colors here. Now, let's press OK. And then let's just run a little comparison here between the images. So as we can see, the very bold colors here, like the blues, the greens, the red and the purple, these are vectorized quite well. Because as we explained earlier, it looks for difference between the colors. So we can see here where there were gradients, because it can't define an infinite number of colors and convert them to vector, it's tried to do the best job it can. If we wanted to define every color in this gradient, it would be almost impossible and take a lot of processing color. So as a general rule, for using the color trace, I would stick to bold bitmaps like this with lots of distinct different colors. If you try to vectorize a photo or something with gradients, it's not going to work so well. So let's have a look at what we can do with an object like this. So at the moment, this is a bitmap. If you zoom in, you can see the pixelation. If we resize it, it's not going to work. And if we use the cut plot window, okay, the only object it detects is the one we already vectorized. So if we remove this completely, all of this, it's going to tell me as before, there's no cuttable object in the current setting. So again, I'm going to select my bitmap and go to bitmap, vectorize, and color trace. Now there are 1, 2, 3 distinct colors here, and also the white background. So we need to select at least 4 from the drop down. You can select more if you want. It won't find any more colors than there are. So I'm going to click and drag here. It detects my 4 colors. So if you hover over one of the colors, we'll see there's a nice little tooltip that pops up over here. So you can press Control and click to change the color that it will trace. So as a basic example of this, every time it detects a white, every time it traces white, it's going to change it to blue. So you can already begin to modify your design by holding Control and clicking one of the individual colors here. So this is an easy way already to change the colors of your traced bitmap. And if we look here, it says you can hold Shift to toggle the trace. So let's show you how that works. So if I hold Shift and click on the black, it won't trace the black. It will separate it and it will ignore it. So let's say, for an example, we didn't want the blue background and the blue center. We just hold Shift and click to toggle it. We turn it off and we can just click OK. Sometimes you will get some errors like so. It needs the white background because the white background was defining the color of the ball. So it's easy just to undo that. Go back to the color trace, trace the object like so. And then you can remove the white sections from the back. And there you are. You have your white color, which you can just compound into the image. And as we mentioned before, this is all now separate vector objects. So you can work with these as you would like. If we take it into cut plot, it is a cuttable object, also with the background that we took. So let's delete that. It's now a cuttable object. It's vector. You can edit it. You can resize it. There we are. And just as another example here, we'll show you how you can detect multiple colors as well. So it doesn't just have to be 3 or 4. You can do it anywhere up to 16 distinct colors. So we'll do color trace again, click and drag. Oops. First we have to change this. So we'll up it all the way to 16. Click and drag. There we are. And so my background was already toggled off. So I can just hold Shift to toggle my background on. And there we go. So now if we come back to our selection tool and we remove the old bitmap from the background, we can see all of the colors have been detected. All of the colors have been traced. This is vector, it's cuttable. Voila. And so those are just some simple examples of how you can work with black and white logos and also colored logos that are quite distinct. So remember, if there's a lot of gradients in your logo, in your object, it's not going to trace very well. But if they're bold, distinct colors, like so, and I mean, you can see the colors aren't too far away from each other, some of them, but because they're quite distinct, it's quite easy for the software to trace it. There we are. So that's the auto trace and the color trace in the software. So let's look at another example now. Let's wait, stop for a second. Do we have any questions? Can I get a copy of the webinar? Would appreciate the recording. Yes, to anyone who would like a recording of the webinar or a VOD of the webinar, we will send one to everyone who attended by default. And we will also be posting the webinar on our YouTube channel afterwards for future reference. Let me just plug in my network cable. Okay. So let's start a new file, and we're going to move on to the next functionality, which will be the Bezier curves. So for this one, we're actually going to do a comparison. So this is quite a pixelated bitmap. If we zoom in quite far, you can see that the edges and the corners, the curves, they're not very clearly defined because of all of the noise around the outside of the image. So it can happen quite often that you get images from your customer or logos from your customer that are quite badly pixelated like this. So let's have a little look about how we can sharpen those. So first of all, we're just going to go ahead and use the auto trace function again. So we have a comparison. We're going to trace our object and then move the trace to the side here. So it's like a little comparison. Let's try moving some of this down to the bottom. Okay. There we go. So we can see that it's traced it relatively well, but there's some issues with the tracing because the pixelation is so bad. And again, as we mentioned before, the auto trace is quite a quick and easy tool. It's not the best tool for getting perfect sharp lines. So if you have a bitmap that is pretty bad quality like this, and you want the tracing to be better, let's take a look at how we can do that. So we'll leave our auto trace up here for now, and then we're going to look at the Bezier curve tool. So again, we select our bitmap, and we go to bitmap, vectorize, and Bezier. And this is going to plot Bezier curves based on distinct points in the bitmap. So in short, what it does is it plots points here and then creates a curve following the edge of the bitmap. So as we can see, it kind of ignores a lot of the fuzziness around here by plotting curves instead. So if we drag this one down here, we can see that it has traced our object with very smooth curves compared to something like the auto trace maybe. But the points aren't going to be perfect. So some of them are, where there are very clear, distinct points in the design, like here. You'll get quite a distinct point with the Bezier curve. But on the points where it's more blurry, like this one here, you're going to get more like rounded corners, like so. So the Bezier curve is good for getting like a higher quality curve from your object, but it doesn't quite do it on the corners. So let's have a little look at another tool that we have. So we select again our bitmap. We go to bitmap, vectorize, and enhanced corners. Now this is kind of similar to the way the Bezier curve works, but you can improve the noise suppression and the corner detection here. So this design, although there are curves in the center here, most of our corners are supposed to be very defined. It's quite a pointy, a sharp design. So this is an excellent example of when you would like to use enhanced corners. So we're going to set the tolerance up quite high and increase the noise suppression. So on our paths, we get nice flat curves like this. And we're going to increase our corner detection to 100%. And what this is going to do is it's going to, in areas where we have these curves, where the bitmap is quite pixelated, it's going to sharpen them automatically. So we set our corner detection high, our noise suppression high, and let's press OK. And then we have our comparison here. Sorry, let's zoom in. And what this does is instead of plotting curves, it really helps to keep your points nice and pointy. That sounds silly. But we see here the Bezier curve has plotted a point here, right at the end, which leads to this curve. But here it's plotted it as a direct, sharp point. So if you want to really have those the sharpness emphasized in your design, you can use the enhanced corners. If you want to keep the curves nice and smooth, you can use the Bezier curve or you can use the enhanced curves. So let's have a look at a couple more examples so that we all understand the tools. We're not exporting, we're importing. We'll import these two files here. So we have here this nice B logo. Our customer wants us to vectorize, to edit it for him, to put it as part of another logo. This is an example of one where the corners need to be sharp. So let's take a look at a couple of comparisons between the Bezier curves and the enhanced corners. So this one here is the Bezier curves. We can see already at the top here, it's created a lot of points which are more rounded, which isn't ideal actually for this object. So especially at the bottom here, if we have a little comparison, it should be nice and sharp, but because of the low quality of the image, it's rounded it out to try and decrease the amount of noise on the outside of the object. And over here as well, if we compare the edges, they should be nice and sharp, but because of the noise around the edges and the way the Bezier plotting works, it probably plots a point here and then makes a curve off of that, which is why we have this small bump here. So just as an example, the Bezier curve will be perfect for an object like this with lots of curves. But for an object like this, that's not what we want. So let's get our bitmap back. and leave this to the side. So this is our Bezier curve. So next we're going to go to bitmap, vectorize, and enhanced corners. Again, we want the corner detection to be nice and high. On an object like this that has not so much noise around the object, we want the tolerance to be quite low, so it makes corners very easily, if that makes sense. So as we see here, if there's an indent from a pixel, with the highest tolerance, it will just ignore that. But here we can leave it kind of low or in the middle because a lot of these corners are very distinct, if that makes sense. So again, we want the noise suppression to be quite high and the corner detection to be very high. So we get our sharper corners and then we press OK. And then I'm going to also note down the enhanced corners. And let's have a little look. So the first thing that we notice here is that the corners are very, very, very sharp. So all on the outside of our object, the corners are sharp, which is very important when you have these kind of these square designs. In the center here as well, there's not these curves that are created by the Bezier curve or by the Autotrace. These are perfect for sharp corners. The other thing to note is it's much, much easier for your cutter to cut straight lines than to cut curves. So if you have lots and lots of straight lines like this, it's going to be a lot easier for your cutter to work with it, even if it's got a tangential knife. So this square sharp design is a very good example of when you would want to use the enhanced corners over something like the Autotrace and the Bezier curve. Okay, I appreciate that was a lot. Are there any questions on those two tools here? Really, my suggestion would be to play around with the different tracing methods like this, have some comparisons side to side, and you'll really start to notice the difference between them. So if you're having issues getting sharp corners, but you're using the Autotrace function, I suggest to use the enhanced corners function, and it will really reduce the amount of noise around the edges of your object. It will make your customers a lot happier, and it will make life easier for you and for your cutter, because straight lines are a lot easier than rounded lines like this. Okay, so we'll just take a little look at the enhanced curves as well. The enhanced curves has more limited functionality than the enhanced corners, because a tool like the Bezier curve will typically plot them quite well anyway. But we'll have a look at that just to demonstrate it. So here we're just going to, again, use the simple Autotrace tool to create a tracing of our object. Here we can see where the noise is quite high. It's plotted these extra little nicks here. These are the kind of things that will cause your cutter some issues. If it has to cut a curve and then cut another curve and then a smaller curve, and it will look messy when it cuts. This is when you'll end up with like small little like tags and nicks on your decals. And it's also harder for your cutter to cut because they're not smooth lines. So if you have a lower quality image like this, I'd really recommend using the Bezier curve as your default vectorizing method. And we can see already as a comparison, simply because of the way the tool works, these curves are very smooth. So this is it's going to be a lot easier for your cutter to cut than something with all of these small nicks. So if you're having issues with quality of vectorizing, I'd suggest to try the Bezier curve for curved objects and try the enhanced corners for sharp objects, and you'll really notice a difference. But let's have a look at the enhanced curve tool. Again, it's still under the vectorize menu, but we're going to select enhanced curves instead of enhanced corners. This tool doesn't give you the parameter selection, and the way it works is very similar to the Bezier curve. Anyway, there are just some very minor differences. So we see at some points with the Bezier curve, there are like defined points here, like sharpness, because it will plot 2 points here and then make a curve between those points around the edges of the bitmap. The enhanced curves doesn't have to do that. So we see the curve is extremely smooth, but there's still a bit of noise because of how pixelated the image is. So that's the primary difference. It will plot based entirely on curves rather than using points to make curves. And I'm not sure if we have another good example in this file. This is really the primary example. So where there are these sharp points on the edges of your curve, using the enhanced curves instead of the Bezier curves will mean that they're very, very round. So can you combine two functions? Not really is the answer. When the object is vectorized, it's not a bitmap anymore, so you can't trace it again. You can use the path editing tools to manually edit the functions. If you want something which is in between the sharp corners and the enhanced curves, I would suggest the Bezier curve, because it will keep sharp corners even if the noise reduction isn't perfect. It's just the way the curves are plotted. So if you do have like solid rectangle corners like this, normally it will plot them well as long as there's not too much pixelation in the actual bitmap itself from where you start. Okay. So that's pretty much the content that we wanted to cover in this webinar. I appreciate that it's kind of a lot of information. What about the picture cut and the centerline trace? The picture cut's quite a cool tool. So if you go to bitmap, vectorize, and picture cut, you can set the number of strips here, and you can reverse the image. But let's show you how it's going to look, and then you might understand the purpose of the tool a bit more. So the picture cut is basically, the idea is it takes an image and then allows you to cut that image into vinyl using strips of black and white, like so. So it's actually quite a cool little tool. So it cuts these strips out of your vinyl, and then you can apply them onto like a window or something, and you have this kind of strangely cut image of the bitmap that you had in the first place. So if you can imagine, the difference here is if you want to cut this out of vinyl and stick it on the window, it's going to look like this. But if you want to do it with this, you can stick it on the window, but it will still let light through, and it looks kind of cool. I don't know how to explain that so well. But let's take a look at another bitmap as an example for that as well. I'm not sure what we can do. Yeah, it works. It works better with photos. Eniko, can you send me a photo of your dog on like a quite bold background? We'll see if we can get a better example here. So while we wait for that photo, do we have any further questions? Does it work with a gradient? Kind of. You see, the intention of this is that you cut the image out of solid vinyl, so it will be only one colored vinyl, rather than something else. Okay, so this is an example from Jasper, and this is Lewis. It's Jasper's cat. And if you go to bitmap, vectorize, and picture cut, we trace Lewis, we'll see that you get this the kind of increased thickness on areas where it's darker. So it creates these like very cool patterns that you can cut out of colored vinyl. My trace isn't quite as good as Jasper's. I don't know what he did to get the quality better, but let's have a look. So number of strips, we'll go with like 100 strips or 75 strips. So this will increase the amount of horizontal strips that it cuts. And then we'll select it and wait for it to process again. Okay, and we'll take this away, increase the scale. There we are. That's the quality we're looking for. So it creates these nice kind of contrasting designs, which you would then cut out of colored vinyl, direct to cut, and then it will look like this. It will look quite cool when you stick it on something. The preview for the cut looks weird, but we tried it before and it looks actually quite cool. Very nice. So yeah, you can do this with a gradient photo, like so, and it will make these nice, cool looking strips that you can cut out of direct vinyl. So as you see, these like tabs on the side allow you to apply the strips quite well onto Windows or onto whatever platform you would like it applied to. Okay, do we have any further questions from anybody? At the moment, no. Can you change the curves after vectorizing? Yeah, after an object is vectorized, you can use the normal path editing tools on it. So if you vectorize this with the Bezier curve, for example, and then you have the path edit toolbar. Here you can break the paths as normal, and then you can, yeah, you can increase the corners, sharpen the corners as you would like. So if you get corners which maybe aren't perfect or lines which aren't perfect, you can break the path like at these points, and then you can like select and remove segments and then redraw them yourself if you desire. So again, you can break the path at the plotted points from the Bezier curve. Let me remove, let's see. Let me delete that. And then if you want to replot the points, you can just simply like draw them yourself like that. So if you do get things which aren't perfect from the vectorizing, it happens sometimes because of the quality of the bitmaps which we're provided. Then you can use your path editing tools to redo those. It's not a problem. Is there a webinar on the path edit tools? At the moment, no. But now you mention it, would be a very good webinar to do. So we'll note that one down, somebody, and then we can do a webinar on the path edit tools to show you guys how you can work with those. But to answer the question, yes, you can use the path edit toolbar to redo any lines and curves which aren't perfect. For the first example, the shield for Autotrace. Both sides of the small flower seem to be the same in the bitmap, but vectorized are quite different. It can just be because of the way the noise is different on each side. So as you see, we have a quite big chunk here that we don't have on the other side. So if we're having a look like here, this is a straight line. Let's expand that and make it white so you can see. The noise from the rasterized vector, it's not always the same on both sides, and this can affect how the tracing is done. Now, it will affect the Bezier curve, but you'll see the difference much more in the Autotrace than you will in the Bezier curve, because of the way the functions work. So actually, this image, it's quite big. The quality is not so bad. If you cut this at a decent size on your cutter, it's going to be okay. But if you auto trace it and compare that to a Bezier curve, the difference is going to be noticeable. So as you said here, the differences aren't so bad, but there are some differences between the left and the right side, as you see, because of the way the noise is. But with the Bezier curve, it's less noticeable because of the way it plots the curve, but it is still affected by the noise. And again, if something is bad here, you can always use the path edit tools to change it. That's not a problem. Yeah, sorry. You can use some of the other functions, like for sharpening corners and for rounding corners, for straightening points. Any of these tools can be used. I just cut it to make it perfectly straight for an example. But this would be a good a good webinar, I think, on the Path Edit toolbar. Okay, if there are any further questions, our office is still open for business, but everyone's at home. But we have our phone number is still operational for Europe, Middle East, Asia, Oceania. Our support email address is still fully functional, being monitored. Our info address for any commercial or generic questions is still open, being monitored. And our website with our online chat portal is available for use. Feel free to subscribe, saisubscriptions.com. Latest version of the software, only like €50 a month, plus additional cloud tools, add-ons, always the latest version. Just throwing that out there. Very cheap, very reasonable. Also, our YouTube channel is here for any further guides or videos. And yeah, we'll be sharing our webinar to this channel. If you've enjoyed the webinar series, we upload all of our webinars onto our YouTube channel. So if you want to check some more out or check some guides in your lockdown period, I suggest going to youtube.com/thesai channel or to type SA International, and you'll get access to a bunch of guides and webinars from SAI. Yeah, thank you, everybody. Subscribe now, saisubscriptions.com, Flexi 19. My colleague Marina has also posted the next Flexi webinar in the chat for you, so feel free to join and register for that one. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day and stay safe.